All right, I think we should be up and running. Good morning. My name is Dennis Misigoy, Libertarian, running for U.S. Senate here in the state of Florida. Getting back to the weekly live stream. I know I missed last week, unfortunately. Got caught up with a few other things and had a few, as I remembered, also some connection issues. So hopefully connection is stable today, and we can spend a little bit of time here. So get some of these things that pop up on the screen whenever you get this thing started out of the way, and just talk about the stuff that's going on, man. There's obviously no shortage. Excuse me. I'm just going to kind of go down randomly. Obviously, is what continues to be the big issue, or at least one of the major issues, constantly in our news cycle, being that of the conflict in Ukraine. It came out, I'm trying to think, this is yesterday, or at least this is yesterday with coming out of the Biden administration, posted by Biden on social media, or at least his team, I would say probably more accurately. Again, another additional $800 million in weapons and the like, military assistance. This is on top of, I think it was, $13 billion came out of a recent spending bill. So it's interesting for me to sort of contrast that with the fact that the Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken, last I checked, hadn't communicated with his Russian counterpart, Foreign Minister, I think it's Sergei Lavrov, since the beginning of February, so before the actual invasion began. So we've got this huge conflict, and on the one hand, we're making zero effort for diplomacy. On the other hand, we are just finding more and more money, even again while $30 trillion in debt, even while hitting 8% inflation here at home. I think it's above that last estimate I saw had it at 8.5%. And but we've still got money to go and send over there, and at the same time, even though we're going to send money over there to the tunes of billions and hundreds of millions at least, we're not going to make any effort at diplomacy. And this really isn't that surprising when you pay attention to what some folks have said. Maybe not necessarily within the administration, but certainly people who are connected with the foreign policy establishment, let's say. I recall the comments made by Hillary Clinton herself, I think, early on into the conflict, sort of likening it to Afghanistan in the 80s with the Soviets. And it's real interesting, and in particular when I get into some of these conversations with folks, in particular folks who support U.S. Involvement, in particular at least the armament and providing weaponry and stuff to the Ukrainians, where they think, well, this is because, or exemplifies the fact that they care about what's going on here and care about the people. I think it's quite the opposite. When you go back and you kind of turn the dial and think back to what went on in the 1980s with the U.S. helping to arm not just local Afghans, but also insurgent fighters who came from outside to join them against the Soviets in the 1980s, in the early 80s and late 70s. If you really think about it, I hope that most of us would reasonably come to the conclusion, especially with all the hindsight that's available of what came after the Soviets left, a recognition that the U.S. really didn't care that much about what happened in Afghanistan and the situation with the Afghan people, their condition, their suffering, really wasn't the primary concern. The primary concern was harming the Russians. And think what you will about the experience at that time, or whether successful or not. It is interesting to think about the contrast and really the difference in what the goals are. Because what if your goals were to stop the fighting and save lives, and not just even save lives, but on top of saving lives, which is the most important thing, also just save the country in the sense of not having these entire cities destroyed and all this infrastructure destroyed, because even then once the fighting stops, it's going to be obviously a monumental task to rebuild in Ukraine. And the longer the conflict draws out, the worse it gets. But again, there doesn't seem to be a real interest in trying to get the claw. And I should say there isn't an interest. There's not an interest from the U.S.'s standpoint. Our interests seem to be, or I should say not even our interest as the U.S., I should say our government's interest, our foreign policy establishment's interest, seem to be more in enabling the conflict to continue by arming the Ukrainians so that they can resist a bit longer, so they can inflict some more harm on Russia, and at the same time, that comes at the expense of prolonged war in Ukraine, rather than making an effort to end the conflict through some sort of diplomatic solution. And it's not to say there necessarily would be one, and what that would look like. I certainly have my own ideas in terms of what kind of decisions should be made, but and what concessions folks should be willing to make, I think, that are quite reasonable. But putting that even aside, there doesn't seem to be a desire really on our side to de-escalate. And while it's certainly true that it was Putin's decision to invade, it doesn't seem, for all of the what's the word I'm looking for? For all the superficial messaging that is about it and outrage about it from U.S. leadership, they really don't seem to have that big trouble with the situation in the sense of really trying to change it. What they seem to want to do, or at least I'd say the steps that they're taking, are steps that are not going to bring it to an end, but steps that are going to prolong the conflict. And prolonging the conflict means prolonging the suffering of the people who are there. It means more death. It means more destruction there. So who benefits from that? And there's not many people who benefit from that. But certainly if you're looking at another 800 million in weapons on top of the 13 billion that went out with the spending bill not that long ago, it's obvious that we are sitting here spending money, and that money obviously is going to end up going to whoever's making the weapons that we're paying for to get sent over there. So it says a lot about the interest when you think about who wins or who gains out of this sort of thing. It should be a little bit telling, and unfortunately the actions that we're taking, I don't think in the long term are going to benefit the Ukrainians. And again, as I think everyone acknowledges, they're the victims in all of this. They're the ones caught in the crossfire and having their communities destroyed and their nation destroyed, and obviously many of them getting killed. So it is a tragedy and something where we are, again, why I think the policy needs to be reevaluated. Again, we should be pretty much doing the opposite. I think full tilt diplomacy and not sending weapons in there. But it's just a question of what the objective are. If your objective is to save lives, it's diplomacy, not escalation. If your objective is bleed the Russians, which some people have openly stated that, then this is obviously what they want to do. But if you're going to bleed the Russians, it comes at the expense of Ukraine and its people. So PBD. I don't know if I know that one, but Roman, if you want, send me a link in the comments. I'll take a look, or reach out, or if you know anybody over there, so we can make that happen, man. I'm happy to show up on anybody else's, and should have some exciting stuff coming up soon, I think. Just podcast wise and doing some things. Hoping to be back down in Miami next month for a little bit. So. But that, a little bit of the, recent happenings with the Ukraine issues. Obviously one of these ones that dominated the news. Speaking of foreign policy, but talking about something way, way in the past, and just a random point of interest. This one, the one Joe was on. Joe Jorgensen, the Libertarian presidential nominee from the last election cycle. Peter Bet David, I think is the guy's name. I did watch a little small clip of that, so okay, I'm gonna look into that one. Let's see. But this was funny in terms. I didn't say funny, not funny at all. But interesting, peculiar is more what I mean. That kind of funny, where it's something that doesn't look quite right. It looks a little funny to me. Anyone who's familiar with the story of the USS Liberty, I was listening recently to some of the survivors from the USS Liberty on the Jocko Willink podcast recently, and I didn't finish listening to the whole episode, but I'm more or less familiar with the story. But which is an interesting one, just because you have this U.S. ship that's attacked by Israeli forces, and in particular, listening to some of the recounting of the events and listening to what seemed like a real deliberate effort to sink the ship. I mean, I guess any attack on a ship, you would expect that to be one of the goals, unless it was like pirates trying to rob it or something. But in this case, it was military forces. They got torpedoed and everything else. A bunch of them, seemed to have been able to evade, but they got some hits. And obviously, anyone who's familiar with the story, you can go listen to it and get a little more detail on that. But here was the one interesting thought I had, which was this. Had there been no survivors, had the ship actually been sunk and there were no survivors, what would the official story have been? That's something I wonder about when I think about stuff like, and in particular, pretty close in time frame, something like Operation Northwoods, which was, if you're not familiar with it, an idea by the CIA to go ahead and basically commit terrorist attacks, kill Americans, and blame it on Cuba in order to start a war there. So, and again, I don't want to just make an assertion that this would have ended up being something like that had there been no survivors on the USS Liberty who could have attested to what actually happened. But here's my wonder, is just that had the USS Liberty had indeed had no survivors, what would the official story have been? And what would it have led to? It's a real curious question, especially when you think about that ship being in the middle of all the conflict that was going on at that time in the Middle East. What would it have meant, and what would have been, what would have been the story? I don't know. But you can kind of look at what the information we have about that time frame, and certainly the circumstances of it, how it has played out since, and at least let the wheels turn in your head and wonder, what would have happened had there been no survivors? What would have been the official story there? I thought that was an interesting thought, so I wanted to share that. Recently, here's another one that's been recently, earlier this week, I believe it was, President Biden announcing his efforts to step up regulation and prohibition on unlicensed, and in particular we're talking about ghost guns, 3D printed, custom firearms, and everything, which is I guess it's just more exemplary of the sort of relentless effort by people in the political class to undermine the Second Amendment. And it's no surprise, because the Second Amendment, what it's about is about ensuring that the people have the power, in particular, to protect themselves from government overreach, from government, just going completely out of control. The stuff that we've seen in other countries, pretty much any dictatorship, in order to lock down and assert control, pretty much needs to be able to control the availability of weapons so that only those people that are approved by them can have it. And the only way that happens, first of all, or at least the way that they get there, first of all, is by finding out who everybody that has them. Now, the Second Amendment protects your ability to keep and bear arms. However, the government has sort of tried to chip away at that for so long by putting regulations around everything else, around the sale of them, the production, and this and that and the other thing. However, I mean, it's still technically always been legal that if you produced your own firearm, there was no way they could prohibit you from having something in that sense if you simply were able to make it. Now, historically, that's a pretty niche skill and not something that most people were able to do, not something that most people had the means or the tools to do, to go and create their own firearms. Obviously, today that's gotten a little bit different, and it has become more and more accessible to people to be able to construct their own. And, working around the legal definitions and everything else to be able to, okay, what parts can and can't you sell and provide to other people, and the market has sort of worked around these issues in order to provide people a solution where people can have the means to protect themselves, can have these means, can exercise these rights, and not be burdened by the all of the efforts by the government to sort of sink their tentacles in. Now, again, they're trying to step up their involvement in this, and I think it's important now as ever to, again, reassert that this is not only just that this is a constitutional right, but in particular to try to undermine it through executive orders and actions like this unilaterally by the president is illegal, invalid. Again, just because the people in government today want to do something doesn't give it validity, certainly doesn't make it legal in the system we have under the Constitution. The Constitution sets out what powers the government has and places concrete limits on them. This is one of them. And yet they are relentless in trying to do this. But, in this case, it doesn't matter that much whether it's the president himself or whether he actually does go to Congress, even though obviously that would be a little closer to constitutional, except for the fact that anything Congress would be doing here would also be unconstitutional because they don't have the power to override this unless they were actually going and amending the Constitution to make it so. But obviously that's not a process that's going to succeed in modern times, and in particular, So it is one of these efforts where I'm calling out what it is. And again, another effort to undermine our Second Amendment rights. And it's one of these things where I want to make sure that we point out the contrast between myself and our incumbent senator, Marco Rubio, who is, so far as I've seen, completely silent on this issue, which is not surprising because he's the guy who's constantly sponsoring red flag laws nationwide in the U.S. Senate. He is not an advocate for the Second Amendment, not a believer in the innate right of individuals to own any sort of weapon necessary for their protection, that they are the best to determine that. He wants to ensure that there's some kind of oversight and maintain the apparatus which would allow government to exert control to prevent undesirables or whomever he might determine, or some other government agency might determine they don't want to have firearms because, dangers to them, and more than anything, dangers to them being able to do whatever it is they want to do. That's really how this situation goes, and typically how this plays out. So, in order to give Florida an option for a senator who is serious about upholding these kind of rights, who's going to speak out about it, because it ain't going to be Rubio, it obviously isn't going to be Demings. She'll support these kind of measures, and not just support these kind of measures, she'll support these kind of measures and still have been, the police chief who essentially gave a gun away to criminals, had it stolen out of her car, very famously, and to this day, I don't believe that gun has been recovered, and we don't know how many crimes it's been used in. Who needs gun control to stop criminals when criminals can just get their guns from a cop's car while it's parked at home? So, go figure. It is interesting. I shouldn't say interesting, but it is to get to one of the issues, and again, I don't want to sound like a broken record on this, but it is remarkable to me as listening in on conversations or participating in conversations where people are going on about what's going on in terms of the economy, specifically with relation to inflation, prices going up on a lot of the basic things across the board that we depend on day after day for our lives. And as people are seeing the impact here, there, and everywhere, all of the different arguments about what the cause is, and it seems it's interesting to me that people are so able to push this narrative that it is either corporate greed or some other nefarious. I shouldn't say it in such generic terms, because there is a nefarious force behind all this, but the willingness to try to put it in this way, to just say, well, a corporation, it's just corporate greed. It sort of strains credulity, because what are we saying? Are we saying that corporations weren't greedy 2, 3, 5 years ago? I mean, it defies logic. There is, we know what's gone on in the last couple of years in particular that got us to this point. Obviously, we've had a few decades of rampant spending, and there's been a little bit of the printing press running to make it all possible. But we really went into overdrive in the last 2 years. All the crazy stuff that was done in response to COVID, everything that went on with it, and the Federal Reserve themselves. I need to go find the clip and actually get it saved and go put it together with something. But it's Jerome Powell on 60 Minutes, and they ask him point blank, "You flooded the system with money," and he's like, "Yeah, we did." And he explained all the different mechanisms that they use to create money. He said printing money digitally, and again, it's a push of a button, and they can increase the money supply. And there's trillions, and they're buying, whether it's government bonds or even private securities, putting cash into the system that came from nowhere. And you simply cannot just create money out of nowhere and have it and expect that it has no effect. And it was really troubling. I didn't say troubling, but it is a problem that folks either aren't aware of it, don't understand it, or are unwilling to acknowledge that fact. I think most people, reasonably, when you're doing it outside of the sort of hyper-partisan political context, can understand that. When you double the money supply, when you increase it by so much, it's going to have an impact on the value of the currency. And that's what we've got. There's no getting around it. And the question is, how do we, not necessarily get around it, but how do we get out of it? And there's a lot of things we can do. Cryptocurrency is one of the modern tools available, to give us a free market option, or free market options, I should say, in terms of means of exchanging value, of transmitting, transferring, so that we have a medium to go between without dependency on simply U.S. dollars, Federal Reserve notes, which have clearly been mismanaged. Now, you can't flip the economy overnight in this sense, but I think we might be surprised. We might be pleasantly surprised if we did give the market the freedom, give individuals the freedom to go ahead and accept whatever they wanted as legal tender, and specifically to authorize the use of Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies as legal tender. I think it does give us an opportunity to get to something, in particular with Bitcoin and the dependency on blockchain. Allows you to have something that's legitimately decentralized rather than a centrally managed currency. Unfortunately, the record of history has shown that at some point, sooner or later, a centrally managed currency that is run by, if not the government itself, a sort of government-adjacent agency like a central bank, what you end up with is where the money supply is going to be manipulated for the benefit of some entities or another, based on an agenda, and at the cost or at the expense of everybody else who's holding that currency, to achieve some other end that really typically is not going to be to the benefit of everyone. And it's very rare that you can find an objective that is to the benefit of everyone. something like that. You know, we're always told about serving the greater good, that sort of thing. So, let me see. But this is where we are with it in terms of that. There's another interesting thing. I haven't posted anywhere. I need to go and post it. But an article I came across while looking at a discussion with recently about the U.S. Some of their interactions with, in particular with India. India had recently sort of announced that they were going to kind of side with Russia in this current conflict, where there's been this obviously everything going on around the invasion in Ukraine, people picking sides and supporting one or the other, and India had kind of decided to lean with Russia, and I think they were going to announce that they were going to be buying more gas from them and not pricing through dollars. But here's what was interesting about this, was that kind of as a response to not getting what they wanted from the Indian government, the U.S. government started sort of making a bit of noise, let's say, in public about human rights abuses in India. Now, this isn't to say that there is not and may not be. This is not to say that there are not legitimate concerns or whatever, and it's certainly not to assuage that. But what's interesting is, when does the U.S. do this? And for most of us who are sort of critical of it, we kind of have already seen it. We've already known it. It's not that well hidden. A lot of us know that the U.S. has numerous allies who have very, very poor human rights records. Saudi Arabia is probably one of the most obvious, but there's certainly other countries. But, and at the same time, the U.S. will be calling out human rights abuses in other countries while turning a blind eye to, like I said, those in ours, are amongst our allies. Now, that's something that is sort of self-evident, but at the same time, it's never really explicitly stated. However, as an exception to that, there's actually an interesting article I came across, and I need to post it across all the little social media I have. But whereas actually going back in 2017, when Rex Tillerson was first coming on as Trump's Secretary of State, first Secretary of State in the Trump administration, not being a foreign policy establishment guy, he was coming from the corporate world, and interestingly enough, he needed to get a crash course in this simple strategy or this approach, and it is basically spelled out in a memo that was leaked. That, look, yes, we're gonna talk about human rights abuses when it's somebody we don't like in order to put pressure on them to do this or that, and we're gonna make a big deal about human rights abuses. But with our allies, well, we don't want to start trouble with our allies, so we're not really going to talk about human rights abuses there, which essentially highlights the fact that there really isn't a genuine concern about human rights abuses in our foreign policy establishment, in our two-party establishment. They'll talk a good game. They will talk about a lot of these things as they'll make talking points out of it. They will as stuff to campaign on, as stuff to sell to the media, or when they're trying to put pressure on certain governments, which their issues with are completely different. That's, I guess, what's important to understand, is that the issue that we have whenever we're calling that out, or whenever our government is calling this out against another government, that's not really the reason why they're doing it. Again, it's not to say those aren't legitimate issues, and people, regular people, don't have a good reason to be legitimately outraged over that. But that's not what motivates our government to call out human rights abuses anywhere else. What motivates them to do it is the fact that this country, this government, is not cooperative, is not getting in line with the U.S. global hegemony. The U.S.'s desire to oversee the world, to be policemen of the world, have everyone be compliant with them. Governments that aren't in line with that are the ones where this stuff is going to get called out on, and start to get called out on, and it's going to become a bigger and bigger talking point, and that's going to be used possibly to justify other things, maybe sanctions or whatever else. But but it's a tool, it's a weapon. It's not, there's not a sincere concern for human rights. And again, I think a lot of us recognize that already, those of us who are kind of already been critical about U.S. foreign policy for a long time. But it is, I did find it pretty noteworthy, the fact that it was spelled out plainly in that article that I saw. So really is something worth taking a look at, and I'll get around to posting that. I'm at about time, guys, so it's been great speaking with you guys. I'm going to, among other things, I'll see you guys next week. But again, if you haven't already, visit the website. If you're not subscribed or you're not following either the YouTube channel if you're watching it here, or Facebook if you're following the campaign page, make sure you're following that. Subscribe to the YouTube channel. Follow on the other social media. On Twitter, it's at Dennis Misigoy. On Facebook and Instagram, it's at Elect Misigoy. All one word, no space, no underscore, no nothing. Trying to think what else. And of course, visit the website misigoy.com if you can. Contribute anything. Again, we are starting to come towards the big time in the summer where it's going to be more important for us to have to get some of the resources we need to really start being able to do some more outreach, as well as even just ensure that we're going to be there. To just make sure that we're going to be there in November. That's key. We can't take anything for granted. So we're going to be doing some work along those lines. But so if you can support it, if you like what you hear, if you want to support these positions and you think that these principles and this perspective deserves a place, help us out. Visit the website and support it in any which way you can. Also share these videos. Do everything you can. I really appreciate the support, guys. And wrap it up from there. Thank you guys for joining and tuning in. And again, I will talk to you guys next week. Thank you.